Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to give it a minute or so for everybody to come on in, and then we'll get started with our really exciting conversation today. I still see some people coming on in, so we'll give it one more minute. Okay, let's get started. I'm excited. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Allies for Justice, from Conditional Allyship to Conviction, Courage, and Consistency. I'm Holly Mendelson, and I'm the co-owner and co-publisher of Insight into Academia magazine, the longest-running national publication dedicated to best practices in higher education. Before we start, I want to mention that we are recording the session, so if anybody needs to leave before it's over or you want to share this with friends, it will be posted in our website probably within the next week or so you will have access to it, because I know it's going to be a really rich and robust discussion today. We're also planning to leave time for questions and answers at the end. That's our hope, but if the conversation gets rolling and we can't get to it, you'll let me know. My email address is available in the Zoom invitation you all got, and I will be able to hook you up with whoever you have a question for, and we'll be able to go from there. So today we are going to dive deep into what it really means to be an ally and what meaningful allyship looks like when it's tested in real time. Our esteemed group of panelists, who I will introduce you to in a moment, will explore the evolving challenges, tensions, and responsibilities surrounding allyship today, including what it means to move beyond performative or conditional support towards sustained, justice-centered action grounded in courage, accountability, and conviction, moving from conditional allyship to principled, justice-centered action, allyship rooted in affinity versus allyship rooted in conviction, why gaps persist between stated values and real-time intervention during critical moments, and how individuals and institutions can build greater consistency, accountability, and courage in allyship. I'm going to introduce our amazing panel of experts and thought leaders now. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Vanessa Brown, who I've worked with for a long time and absolutely adore. Dr. Brown is Southern Illinois University Edwardsville's retired professor and associate athletic director for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and chief diversity officer. And she's also a member of our Insight into Academia editorial board. Dr. Sheila Caldwell, who we also adore, is Vice President of Anti-Racism, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer for the Southern Illinois University System, and she's also an Insight into Academia editorial board member. Ms. Christina Castillo, who I've had the honor of getting to know more recently, is Program Coordinator, Center for Rural Health and Social Service Development at Southern Illinois University School of Medicine. Mr. Ray Chang, who's president, pastor, and author of the Asian Christian Collaborative and executive director of the 10 by 10 collaboration for Fuller Seminary. And Dr. Wilmore Webley, he's professor and senior vice provost for equity and inclusion at University of Massachusetts Amherst. And Dr. Mary Yeboah, school leader and consultant, International Peace and Justice Collaborative. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know we're going to have a really deep and incredible conversation, and I'm so excited to be here with all of you and be able to host this discussion. So thank you again, and thank you everybody who's joined us to listen in. Okay, let's get started. Allyship is a term that can mean different things to different people. How do you define allyship? What would you say is the difference between allyship rooted in justice and allyship rooted primarily in personal relationships or shared interests? Sheila, I'd love to start with you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Holly. And I also wanted to acknowledge Lenora, our Pearlstein. I know she's out there as well. And we just really appreciate both of you for this timely and important dialogue, and also for being steadfast partners in this work. And what I wanted to say that this conversation is building off of the article written by Dr. Vanessa Brown and I've linked the article in the chat for those of you who are interested. So please, if you get a chance to please review that. And again, for the purposes of this conversation, I wanted to specifically quote how our philosophy is surrounding the topic that we're addressing today, and really the difference between allyship rooted in justice and allyship rooted in affinity. And we specifically say allies to people often operate from emotion, proximity, or social capital. Their advocacy fluctuates depending on how they feel about a group at any given time. Allies to justice, however, are rooted in principle. They challenge corruption, confront hate, and disrupt inequity regardless of who is affected. Their commitment does not waver in the face of personal disagreement or discomfort. So we're arguing that we need to rethink how we define allyship, because we have observed allies who seem to be more people focused rather than principle focused. And we are arguing for allies to be focused on the principle of justice, and for that support to not be conditional but unwavering, and that it should also not depend on whether you agree with a group's decision, their political views, or their methods. I think many of us have had an opportunity, I would say some, to read articles, to look at social media, where people have made comments, for example, that certain groups are getting what they deserve based on how they voted. And we had conversations about that as far as this group, because we like, okay, is that really how an ally for justice think? Is that how they should think? Advocates for equity and justice believe in right and wrong, regardless of how a person voted, what political party they belong to, or whether we agree with their choices. Even if somebody voted against their best interests, or maybe didn't know that at the time, and maybe we realizing that now, our attitude should still be one of, compassion and empathy, and not necessarily, again, you're getting what you deserve. Because we believe fundamentally that an ally for justice believes that everybody deserves human rights. They deserve to be treated as fully human, and they also deserve dignity and respect. And when we begin negotiating those principles based on political outcomes, feelings, or social affiliation, we know that we've moved away from justice, and we're actually, again, looking at the person and not the principle. I also want to just give a few more examples of conditional allyship. Some people support marginalized communities until progress begins to challenge their own comfort, status, or sense of advantage. So I want to talk about this concept. We've seen articles about reverse discrimination. In fact, I think I just saw an article last week about 15 medical schools being sued on the concept of reverse discrimination. And I want to talk about that for a moment, because we have allies, again, who think, well, okay, I support you, but I also do not support reverse discrimination. So let's just talk about that for a moment. And I'm going to use my particular group as an example. African Americans experienced approximately 246 years of slavery in the country, and 100 years of Jim Crow. And we know that the Civil Rights Act was only passed in 1964, and the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So we've had about 60 years of civil rights protections in the form of law. But we've had more than 3 centuries of legalized oppression and exclusion. And so I'm thinking of this quote by Malcolm X when he said, if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, there's no progress. If you pull it out all the way, that's not progress. Progress is healing the wound that the blow has made. And so his point was that justice is not about ending harm, it's also repairing the damage that's caused by harm. And I think allies for justice would ask the question, how is it possible that you have repaired harm in 60 years when harm was done for 300 years? What people are calling reverse discrimination is simply the definition of justice. And it's not even full justice, it's just the beginning of justice. And how do we know that? Is because we can look at groups and we can look at the data and we can see disparities when it comes to almost any structure that we have in American society. If we look at healthcare, we see clear disparities. If we look at educational outcomes, whether it's at K-12 or higher ed, we see disparities. If we look at the justice system, incarceration, we see who is penalized more for the exact same crimes. And so we somehow think, well, we don't want reverse discrimination when we're actually seeing just the beginning of justice. I think that we should think about what our definition of justice is as we have this conversation, as we think about allyship. And so again, the goal is to support fairness, even when it benefits people who are different from us, even when we don't necessarily receive a direct benefit, and even when the outcomes challenge systems of advantage. I think that's one of the conversations we want to also think about today as well, because again, in my work, I've done climate surveys recently with Viewfinder. That's another one of the works of insight into academia. And we have comments that say, hey, we feel like this group has gotten enough, and now it's time to maybe kind of halt the brakes a little bit. And again, we're challenging those notions of justice. So these are some of the paradigms that we want to think about as we move forward. Well, what does it look like to be impartial? What does it look like to be consistent and be sustainable? And the only way we could do that is starting from the premise that everyone deserves dignity, everyone deserves to be treated a certain way, and those core principles are not negotiable. So thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. That was really incredible. Mary, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Sure. Thank you, Sheila, for leading us off with that definition. I think I align so deeply with how you've framed allyship for justice. One of the things I'll add in terms of how I think about or define allyship is it uniquely having to do with an understanding of one's privileges within our identities in the context of power and oppression. And so extending that definition to consider how allyship includes action that dismantles systems of oppression that benefit me. I find that to be an interesting framing as well, and a complex one too, because while the privileges afforded to certain groups by the systems of power that sustain itself are very real, they're also made up. So the racial construct, for example, is entirely made up on the idea that separating for example, Black and white people, to keep them from allying with each other. That's the allyship piece. When people ally with each other, then they amass the power necessary to withstand oppression. And so I find it interesting that it's really a lie rooted in capitalism to think that my allyship in my actions that seek to dismantle the systems that afford me privilege will in some ways lessen my own privilege is actually participating in a lie that my privileges need to go down in order for another groups to go up. And one example that I'll quickly give is my work with within the context of mass incarceration, serving on the Justice for Keith Lamar team, friend of mine in death row in Ohio. I use that as an example, both as a systemic and individual approach to allyship, me not being an incarcerated person, nor Black or brown, of which is a group of people that's most subject to a basic concept of the presumption of innocence or the presumption of guilt. So my privileges in my white skin and my female body, I'm afforded the privilege of the presumption of innocence. And I can fight to dismantle, not only dismantle that system, but like Sheila said, participate in building something new and something more just and equitable for everybody. But the idea that the presumption of innocence should be a privilege is a lie, because it's actually a constitutional right. So in my taking action in any way, some sort of allyship in this context is really not the idea that I need to lose my privileges, but everybody ought to be afforded the privilege of the presumption of innocence. And that sort of, I think, informs how I show up in this space, that while I'm seeking to partner with identity groups that are different than my own, the commitment to justice, like Sheila already says, what drives a belief that I stand that all people ought to have access to the same rights that allow them to be safe and healthy and well in a community. So that's sort of how I think about and define allyship in that way.
Thank you, Mary. I appreciate that. And it's a lot of food for thought. Wilmore, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Holly. And thank you, Sheila, for that great start to defining this, and for the really excellent paper that you and Dr. Brown have put together. I think it really brings this to the forefront. To be honest, allyship is not something that I gave a lot of thought to until a year ago. when I started this fellowship with NADOHE, and my mentor turned out to be Dr. Vanessa Williams, Dr. Vanessa Brown. And she started talking about this in a way that drew me in. And it was at a moment, I think, when a lot of us were in a state of confusion, when so many things were changing daily, uncertainty in every aspect of the academic structure. And as I've thought about this in preparation for this webinar, I would start off by saying allyship is not an identity that someone claims, but it's really a pattern of choices, of action, as Mary stated. And it's through these patterns of choices that we demonstrate our values as they are being tested. And so in my estimation, then I define allyship as an intentional and consistency that has been so emphasized, practice of using one's influence, one's voice, one's privilege, one's resources, one's positionality and authority, one's advantages to advance fairness, dignity, belonging, and equitable treatment of every single person, because that person turns out to be a human being just like you are. And for me, that's important, because if we center humanity in this, then it becomes more feasible to stand up for justice. And so it challenges, therefore, the tendency to only align with people who we like or who we know or whose identity we can that resonates with us, rather than allying for justice itself. And so, Dr. King said in the letter from Birmingham, one of the greatest obstacles to justice is not necessarily overt opposition, but the tendency of well-intentioned people to prefer comfort, order, and the absence of tension over meaningful change. And we can't be allies, true allies, if we resist being uncomfortable. We can't be true allies if we don't understand what justice means. We can't be true allies if we don't support fairness when circumstances are not favorable. And in higher education, I think we're contending with this. Allyship is often celebrated when it's visible and affirming and low risk. Institutions often issue these verbose statements, and individuals express support, and we have communities that rally around causes that resonate with their values and experiences. And yet the true measure of allyship emerges not during these moments of consensus, but during moments of tension and conflict and consequence. That's when the more difficult question needs to be asked. Do you continue to be supportive, or do you acquiesce because it no longer aligns with what you're comfortable with? One of the most important distinctions there that Sheila made, and that is made in that paper, is the argument that allies who are primarily attached to people often operate from a place of emotion, and affinity and social conformity or proximity, rather than operating in a space of justice. And so what happens then when speaking up carries professional risk? What happens when the person experiencing harm is not someone who you know personally? What happens when justice requires us to challenge our colleagues who we respect and care about? What happens when you have to challenge policies and traditions or even systems that you've benefited from, once you realize that there is injustice embedded in it? So justice-centered allyship operates differently. It is rooted in the principle rather than preference. It recognizes that a person's dignity, a person's rights, and access to equitable opportunities are not contingent upon whether we agree with them or understand them or identify with them. It is really the realization that justice should be defended regardless of personal feelings, political disagreement, or social distance. And so justice-centered allies recognize that rights, dignity, fairness are not rewards for good behavior. They're principles that must be upheld consistently. And I think a lot of times we get caught up in this notion that, oh, I'm rewarding somebody by standing up for them. Most importantly, allyship is not a permanent status that one achieves. It is an ongoing practice of learning, accountability, and action. I have to wake up every day and make a decision that today I'm going to stand up for justice. Today I'm going to be brave. Today I'm going to stand for that person who seems not to have a voice. Today I'm going to stand and I'm going to speak up in that meeting with all of the influential people around me. I'm going to speak up for justice, even if nobody else is aligned with me. And so throughout my work, I've seen where people are easily stand up when it's easy to do so. And the question is really whether people support equity in theory. I know a lot of people who support equity in theory because it's a good theory. But when it comes down to it, the question is whether they're willing to act when equity requires them to challenge existing principles and practices, confront bias, redistribute opportunity, or hold ourselves accountable. Those moments reveal that allyship is rooted in something greater than we want to think it is. Is it rooted in our self-conceived notions of affinity and alignment, or is it truly rooted in justice and conviction?
Thank you. Some wonderful thoughts. I know, Christina, you're going to have some things to add as well, and would love to hear what's on your mind.
Absolutely, and thank you, everybody, Dr. Caldwell and Mary and Dr. Wilmer for being here with these amazing definitions and setting up this first conversation, right? The first part of this conversation. For me, working with different communities and diverse populations in and out higher education, I consistently define allyship as advocacy in action with empowerment being the end result, with helping those disenfranchised populations and people to be able to raise their voice, to find their voice, and to help them along the way, finding the needs that they deserve to have, right, to meet. And so, of course, for me, this definition has a different components as a counselor, as a person with an educational psychology master's degree. For me, the importance is to have an educated mind and educated heart that aligns. And if they align in the listening, in the learning, in the humanity of everybody, and for us having self-reflection and the willingness to act when action is needed. Sometimes it's very, very difficult to act in those moments, right? But it is important if we are consistent. As Dr. Wilmer mentioned, that consistency, right, is extremely important. And for me, the difference in allyship rooted in justice and personal relationships basically is that the key difference is the consistency. Justice, allyship centered centering justice is to recognize that everybody and every person has to have dignity. Their humanity does not have to be translated, that their humanity does not have to be evaluated, and in their belonging, that I do not have to know somebody in order to make a space for them in this world, in this ample world, right? And so, and also that they deserve every opportunity. And so when we talk about consistency consistently showing up and showing up for that fairness and dignity and inclusion. If I, as a Latina, only help people that look like me and think like me, then I am acting exactly as the same, with the exact same things that creates exclusion in our communities and in our society. So that consistency is very difficult, and sometimes it's very risky and very lonely, especially when we are working in the setting of higher education, right? It becomes sometimes lonely, or we can be the point of mm, of some sort of like, oh, here she comes again, or here we go again with the same thing. But if we are centered in helping people, in seeing their humanity and valuing them for they are, for their dignity, then we have to act with those principles in mind, not acting for people and not performing because it is convenient. Sometimes silence is a lot easier. And in my case and in my experiences, when I am challenged, even if my heart is pounding in my throat, I have to do what is right. And I have to speak up on behalf of those people, and understanding my privileges, and understanding the things that have built me to be at this point, and that I have had the opportunity to speak on behalf of other people that do not have the same privilege that I have. And even as a Latina, as a Mexicana, I do not share the same experiences as people like me. And the understanding that every single people, and even within the same communities and cultural backgrounds, have a specific story to tell. It is just the understanding and the listening and the inclusion and the willingness to help and advocate for them and empower them to find their voice. So for me, that is allyship, and rooted in justice. And yes, we can help our own people, right? But if that's the only focus we have, then that's not standing up for principles. That's standing up for people or for affinity allyship.
Thank you, Christina. Totally agree. So a question for you, Ray. How do we remain committed to justice and advocacy, even if we completely disagree with somebody else's perspective or choices or beliefs, and we look at the world through a different lens? How do we remain committed to justice and advocacy under those kinds of circumstances?
Yeah, great question. And thanks for hosting this, especially in the climate that we're in, and kind of the whole anti-DEI push. It's things like this that really resist and push against kind of power brokers that are trying to create inequities by challenging diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think it's important that we actually have a commitment to justice and understand what justice actually means. So it goes to the article about putting the principle, being committed to the principle as much as you are committed to people. Because if you're not committed to the principle, eventually you'll probably betray the people. Because justice doesn't ask, are you nice? It asks, who pays you when you stay silent? One of the things I find is that comfort loves performative charity, but courage really loves substantive change. And you're going to disagree with people. And so when I say committed to, when I talk about being committed to justice, I'm actually saying that your dignity isn't negotiable, even when I don't agree with you. And there are a lot of people who disagree with me, and a lot of people I disagree with. And when communities build cultures around this kind of justice, challenging harm in real time stops being heroic and actually starts becoming normalized. In all the spaces that I've been in, I've watched people suddenly go silent and quiet when the person that was harmed doesn't actually fit with their ideology, their political thought, their preferences, or when they start telling the story or talking in a way that makes them feel uncomfortable. But if we're only allies for the people we fully agree with, then our advocacy ends up becoming more of a personality test, not a justice practice. I come from a deeply rooted faith perspective, which several others are as well, and I'm convinced that every person carries a worth that I don't get to vote on, which means I can say that I'm not on board with how you're framing this or what you're saying, but still stand against the harm that's being done to you or to your community, because I don't have to agree with someone's story to refuse their mistreatment. And I see this happen all the time. Like on a campus that actually several of us worked at, a student came forward about racism using language that made a lot of people in power bristle. She used terms like white supremacy and used terms like racism. But the power brokers didn't like her rhetoric. They didn't like the social media posts, the choices that she made. But the patterns that she named, dismissal, stereotyping, unequal discipline, actually matched years of quiet complaints from many others. And so being an ally for individuals would have tempted me to pick and choose. I'll support the students that I like, that I resonate with, not the ones who make me feel comfortable. But being an actual ally for justice meant that I had to ask, are the conditions that she's describing real and harmful, even if her approach isn't how I do it? And if the answer was yes, that required action. Basically, if you're committed to justice, what you'll find is that you're committed to fixing the pipes instead of just fixing a leak.
That is a really powerful way to put it. And one of the things in the article, and I know that Dr. Webley has been wonderful in reposting it many times, but I hope everybody who's on the webinar gets a chance to read it. I think the last line really resonated with me, which is justice does not require agreement. It requires principled belief and enduring resolve. And that's really what you talked about. So completely agree. So Vanessa, a question for you. Have you experienced situations where someone identified themselves as an ally, but they either failed to ask whether you wanted their support or if it was needed, or they provided it in a way that they thought was helpful, but maybe it wasn't really helpful, or you felt it wasn't helpful? And conversely, have you experienced allyship that really looks like what you want it to look like, where that person asked what they could do and how they could help support, advocate, show accountability? And what did that look like? And what do these experiences teach us overall about more effective allyship, in your opinion?
Yeah, thank you, Holly, for that question. And Ray, you laid a great foundation. I mean, the whole webinar so far has been just amazing. But Ray, you laid a great foundation for my response to this, because one of the things that I think that when you think about effective allyship, you start thinking about the individual yourself. You know, as I look at my own life and what it means for me to say that I am an ally for justice, but that it comes with a cost. And I think one of the things you have to do is rooted in self-evaluation, self-awareness, is rooted in what are my beliefs, what are my values, what what am I willing to die on, what vine am I willing to die on, and really take a look at yourself and say, what am I really committed to? And I think ultimately asking yourself the question, who am I? As I do this work, or as I just move through these spaces, or I move through relationships, what do I stand for? Because it's going to come a day that, my mother used to say, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. And I think at some point, when you start talking about justice, it takes courage. And courage is not something that is just, it happens. It's something that you really kind of have to do a lot of self-exploration and really kind of know that no matter what room I'm in, I'm going to stand up for what I believe, and I'm going to stand up for what it is, my own value system. And I think that's where I struggle with sometimes when I hear people that talk about there being allies, when in fact they don't even know how to stand up for themselves. And I think one of the things is, how can you stand for me if you can't, or stand if you can't stand for yourself, or you don't have something, you could kind of go with the wind. No matter who's talking, you just go with whatever's going to be beneficial to you. And that's why I think that's the difference. That's why I think it's so important when you think about allies for justice. You're thinking about, it doesn't necessarily have a face to it. It has a cause. It has a belief. It has that everybody has a right. to dignity and respect and equitable outcomes. And everybody has that. And so when you buy into that, you know, that's when change takes place. And that's why I think, as I said, the most important thing is asking yourself the question, who am I? What do I stand for? And no matter, I should be the same person, no matter which room I'm in or what I'm doing when I stand for a certain cause or when I stand for justice. That allows you to help move you from performative responses rather and clearly to true, really understanding what it means to be an ally. So I really, Ray, you kind of laid that foundation for me, and that was great.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. When we all got together and talked a few days ago, Wilmore, you added some additional thoughts in this area. I'd love it if you could share it as part of this discussion.
Yeah, I really like the framing from both Ray and Vanessa here. I think it's a great framing. I want to step back a little bit and say that many times when I've seen it many times when people step into a situation as allies and come short. And I first off want to say that in my experience, these people came in with good intentions. They did not come in with the intention to harm or to hurt. But oftentimes, good intentions do not automatically translate it into effective support. And people don't immediately understand that. And the big mistake that I see people make is that they step into these spaces of allyship without first listening, without first understanding what is needed. And as Dr. Brown said, they step into these spaces oftentimes without knowing really who they are and without having ever stood up for themselves in tough situations. So they assume that understanding the problem, the desired outcome or the appropriate response is what they're going for. But many times we see these individuals come to an issue that they don't fully understand. And they make a mistake right there. We see people who come in and instead of asking, how can I support you? What is it that you really need? Is support needed? And if so, what is most helpful? We see people coming in with preconceived ideas of what they think they should do in these spaces. And this is where people make errors. So I don't want to alienate people who have a desire to be allies and want to step into that space. But when you come into a space and you ask somebody, what is it that you need? How can I be helpful? It conveys a level of humility that we must step into these spaces of allyship with. You have to step into that space knowing that you don't understand or fully know what that person is going through. And until they convey that to you, you neither have the permission nor the tools to move forward and to be an effective ally. Another challenge that arises when allies become more invested in being seen, as Dr. Brown talked about, being seen rather than being effective, is that sometimes support is offered publicly when what is actually needed is private support, right? I see it all the time. This person doesn't need a bullhorn out there. What they need is your private support when that is what is required. Sometimes people want dramatic action when what is needed is sustained engagement. Sometimes people focus on symbolic gestures when really a structural change is what is required. And sometimes people become frustrated when the support that they offered is not received in the way that it was expected to be received. That's because time wasn't spent asking the right question. How can I be useful? And so I just wanted to add that to the conversation. As I said, it was very well stated by my two colleagues here.
I think we also acknowledge that becoming an ally for justice is an evolution. It is not something that you decide, that's what I'm going to be today, and now I am. It's a learning journey, just like everything else in life. And to your point about humility, it's also being able to look in the mirror, recognize when you've made a mistake, self-correct or learn from it, and also ask forgiveness and be forgiven. Allow forgiveness for yourself. If you mess up, acknowledge and move on. because the person or the principles that you are working for and supporting, just like everything else in life, evolve and change, and you evolve and change and grow, and you learn from those mistakes. So
Yeah, Holly, that's why I think it's so important is the more you know you, the more you're in a better position to advocate or to be an ally for someone else. The issue is most times is people are not really clear about who they are. And so, as I said before, and when you don't know you or you know what you stand for, that no matter where you are, if once you know you and you know these are the things, and some people may not even be an, be should be an ally for justice because they don't really know what that means or they're not clear about their own belief system or what they would stand for. So I think it's so important that people do self-evaluation, self-awareness.
I agree. Thank you. So I think we need to acknowledge, and I know somebody mentioned it earlier, what's going on as far as anti-DEI movements, dismantling of offices, programs, initiatives. And a lot of times people will connect allyship to those efforts or offices. But as we've had this discussion, I think we've kind of clearly differentiated. But I do want to acknowledge it. So obviously, these are very charged times that we're living in. Sheila, what do you think this moment reveals about allyship and why and how it must remain grounded in justice rather than dependent upon institutional structures or offices or programs and policies?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I also just did want to build off of what I heard. I was thinking about what Dr. Brown said with the self-awareness and personal conviction, as well as Dr. Webley, and we talked about humility, but I also was thinking wisdom. I mean, that's what actually came. Wisdom and discernment came to mind as he was talking, and the reason why I wanted to just kind of bring those words to the forefront is because I think as we talk about all the things that are necessary and what we actually saw in this moment is that maybe people didn't have as much discernment or self-awareness as we had hoped. We saw a lot of allies come to the forefront, but primarily, if we're being honest, it kind of crumbled under pressure. I mean, we really could ask the question, where were the allies? Where are the allies even now? I was looking at the Chronicle of Higher Education. I mean, many of us who do this work are familiar with their tracker. And as of 2026, 451 campuses across 48 states and the District of Columbia have altered their DEI efforts, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And these changes have included eliminating DEI offices and positions, renaming programs and resource centers, restructuring services, calling things under the broader student success initiatives, and even ending like identity-specific programs that specifically support people who are on the margins who needs those helps and resource. If we look, we didn't see a lot of mass pro-DEI protests. You know, even though based on my 20 plus years in higher ed, I mean, every time I looked up, there was a conversation about allyship. So it was kind of disappointing and also surprising that when it was time for the allies to emerge, to stand up and to say, we support this work, this is how we benefited, this is how it's benefiting us personally, this is how it's benefiting our institutions, we did not hear loud voices. The loudest voices were the ones who were calling to dismantle DEI. I mean, I kind of was like, should I even quote this? But if I could be, even our current president said he was actually surprised at how quickly higher ed caved. I want us to think about that. We surprised him about how quickly we caved in this moment. And so, and I also want to acknowledge that, you know, as we have this conversation, it's not that we're saying we were perfect, that we executed flawlessly, that there were trainings that probably were not the best training. So we're not in any way coming to DI to be advocated or defended in that perspective. But at the same time, I think we know that the impact, and I think all of us can talk about the impact that we've had, that we've been able to improve belonging, improve student success, close achievement gaps. So it's a lot of good things that have come out of our offices, but we didn't even see those individuals supported necessarily in a mass way. We saw institutions step up, but again, I would have thought there would have been mass rallies in addition to what institutions have discussed. And again, we didn't see that. So I think we see that allyship was really tied to convenience. Some people in certain ways may have gained favor from being aligned or having affinity with certain groups. But then when there was like pressure to lose certain capital, social capital, political capital in whatever spaces, and when risk was involved, a lot of those individuals stepped away. It was not at that point worth it for them. And again, it goes back to this conversation about if you're committed to justice, then you really don't see that as an option all the time, right? Because if you have personal conviction, something in you is going to well up and say, I actually need to advocate for this. I need to defend this. But we didn't see that. I want to push back on one other thing too. And I know it was a necessary thing, but when I think about allyship and again, how we caved and how we were so quick to think about, okay, what else do we need to do? A lot of people had concerns about the name. I know in many states that was not even an option. You had legislation. I talked about the 48 states. So there was a lot of legislative pushback. I think in 22 states, there is official legislation on the books that you cannot do this work, right? Even though 48 states have altered the work. But I want to talk about the name because I'm going to say, being in the state of Illinois, and I do have to qualify that, working under the leadership of President Mahoney, our chancellors, the board of trustees, our attorney general. I mean, we have kept the name diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as anti-racism. And I've heard, a lot of sometimes pushback from that. And again, I understand why people have changed the name. But one of the things I want to think about from a historical perspective, the first things they did to enslave Africans when they came to this nation was change their name. So when we try to act like names don't matter, it does matter. They're changing the name to strip you of identity, to strip you of dignity, to strip you of personal agency. So even though I understand why names had to change, I don't think we should take it lightly that we've been forced, and I use that word forced, to change our name. And I'm in a state where we chose not to, again, have to change our name. And we have a governor and leadership, as I mentioned earlier, who defends this. But I don't think we should take it lightly and we should ignore that. And I think about the book that I read with my daughters, Up from Slavery. The first thing they did, Booker T. Washington was 9 years old when slavery ended. And he said in his book, the first thing they did was change their name. The first thing they did was change our name. The first thing that enslaved people who became free did was change their names back. So I think that's something worth fighting for. And again, I recognize the place I'm in. Everybody can't do that. I also want to think about the LGBTQI community as well, and their identity being stripped and people mocking them and being forced. But again, when we talk about justice, when we talk about human dignity, there are things that we take lightly and we should not be taking this lightly. We should continue. Part of justice is giving people agency, is allowing them. I'm not a fan of the voiceless. Unless you literally can't talk, as far as I'm concerned, you actually have a voice and you have agency and you can use that voice. So I think, again, I use the term voice because it was a lot of silence. And I think it revealed a moment about what our true conviction was and what type of risk that we were willing to take to really, truly advocate for this work. And I think it's time for us it's not a lost cause, right? It's still time for us to reclaim this space, and it's time for us to still do the work. And I know we're going to talk about what that looks like later on, but I just wanted to share that, allyship cannot be, dependent or even like an organizational chart. Again, it's committed to justice. And even when policies change, when offices close, and when, public opinions shift, we have to continue to work. Justice-centered people are going to find a way to continue to work because it's not about structure. It is about treating people fairly and justly.
Thank you. Sorry, I was just typing out to everybody on here that we're getting some raised hands along the way, and I really want to encourage everybody to post their questions in the chat to us so that we can answer them and talk about them towards the end. So please feel free to type in questions because we are going to put aside time, and I think that everything that everybody's saying here is so important, and we want to hear what those of you who are here and listening to this conversation, what you're thinking as well. Wilmore, would you like to add anything to what Sheila just said?
Yeah, I'm hoping, Holly, that people didn't miss the statistics that Sheila just shared. This is truly remarkable. When you really think about it, since 2023, when Congress started this push and we started seeing it in different states, 152 bills have been introduced in 30 states across this country to dismantle diversity, equity, and inclusion. To date, 32 of those have become law in different states across this country. 110 of them have been abandoned, but you still have others coming up through the pipeline. The uncomfortable truth that Sheila put to the forefront in this fearless way is that the recent challenges that we're facing with DEI initiatives in higher education and also in the private sector, it has exposed an important distinction between commitment and convenience. It's become night and day. It's like you drove an 18-wheeler through it. It's become very, very clear where people stand. When conditions were favorable, many individuals, many organizations, many institutions were willing to support equity. When the grants were flowing from NSF and from other organizations, everybody jumped on the bandwagon and wrote up for those grants and made their names and got recognition doing the work in those spaces. The current landscape provides, in my opinion, one of the clearest tests of allyship that higher education has faced in decades. And when DEI offices were expanding, various people put their names up to serve in these roles. And those were the first people to say, I will stay in that position, but I don't want the title beside my name because I'm not going to get that grant that I'm writing up for. And I'm not going to get this thing. And I don't want to put myself out there. I don't want to be doxxed. For many years, companies like Target and Walmart and Amazon advocated for diversity, equity, and inclusion publicly. These commitments ran the gamut from supplier diversity programs to employee resource groups to recruitment efforts and leadership development initiatives and public statements, you name it. And they view DEI as aligned with their values and their workforce needs and even their long-term plans and customer expectations. But the question is, when the rubber really hit the road, did their underlying commitments remain when the pressure was turned on? That is the challenge that we face. So to be clear, institutional structures matter. The DEI offices matter, right? Equity initiatives matter. Inclusive policies provide the expertise that we need, accountability, coordination, resources, you name it. They help institutions translate values into practice. They create mechanisms for addressing barriers and reporting incidences on our campuses when they happen so that they can be addressed. So the importance should not be minimized. However, institutions do not create values. They operationalize values. Individuals have values, and we live these values and force institutions to create policies that align with these values. So I've observed that meaningful progress occurs not simply because policies exist, but because individuals choose to act consistently with institutional values, even when doing so requires, as we said before, making difficult and courageous leadership decisions. So in the moment that we find ourselves, I think progress in higher education has never really been linear, right? We can acknowledge that. Advances in access and civil rights, disability inclusion, gender equity, all of this, these are opportunities that we've had to put policies to and to be resilient in the moment. And what sustains progress through those cycles, and Dr. Brown used to remind me, we've been here before. We've cycled through these times before. And so what sustains progress through these cycles is not the permanence of any particular office or policy, but the willingness of individuals and institutions to remain committed to their principles And that is what I think is needed here in this moment. If every DEI office disappeared tomorrow, would our commitments to equity still remain, or would it disappear? That is the test. And that is where we have to ask ourselves, where do I stand? The measure of allyship is what we do when support becomes costly. Are you still doing the work even though the money is gone? Are you still meeting with those students who need you and giving them advice and mentorship, even though the support structure has been pulled away from the institution that you find yourself in? And if you're not doing that, why aren't you doing that? What do you need in order to continue doing that? What sort of introspective assessment do you need to do in order to continue doing that important work? Because every single moment you leave that work undone, somebody suffers. Somebody's educational journey is terminated or significantly derailed. Somebody's family is not going to get the resources that they need for healthcare, for food, for support. I think of my own self. If somebody had prevented me from continuing my education, from getting a higher education, I came from a family where both of my parents were functionally illiterate. They didn't even get a high school education. They invested in me so that I could get an education with the intention that I would come back and be a support to the family. What if I had been derailed by all of the racism and other things that were thrown at me? What if I didn't have those allies standing up for me and creating pathways for me to advance? Then it wouldn't just affect me as an individual. It would affect an entire 2-3 generations of people who became dependent on me. My younger siblings were able to go to high school and college because I had a pathway. So again, when we think about these things, I think oftentimes we don't allow ourselves to go far enough in thinking through them. And so it becomes superficial overall. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. So leading into our next question then, let's say you are an institution where all your programs have been taken away, all your titles have been taken away, all your supports have been taken away. Ray, how do you still, as a higher ed institution or as an organization, create a culture where individuals feel empowered and expected to challenge things like exclusion, discrimination, harmful behavior, when so much of that has not only been taken away, but censored? We don't even talk about it. We won't use the word diverse on our website. Scrub it. How do you build that kind of environment or community?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we lean into our convictions, one of the things that we realize is, going back to like the beginning, the first question is like, is justice a true conviction and commitment that you're making? Because for some people it's a hobby, and other people it's survival. And the challenge is making the people who see it as a hobby understand that it's survival for a lot of other people. But generally, people speak up when two things are true at the same time. First, they feel safe enough to intervene, and then number two, they feel like it's their job to intervene. Cultures that expect real-time challenge to exclusion or harm have been built on purpose. They're not done by accident, and they don't just appear because a campus or organization values diversity. There's a lot of people that make a lot of good statements, but again, there's no substance. I think when you go to the airport, one of the most helpful things is when when you hear the announcement that says, when you see something, do something. Talk about it, tell someone. One of the things that a culture of fear in a lot of higher ed institutions, especially when you get towards the administrative kind of levels, are driven by fear. People don't want to hear the things that will challenge, the perfect image of the institution that they have. But institutions move the needle, treat challenging harm as a shared responsibility, not just as a personality trait that some individuals have and others don't, that the prophets have and the priests don't. And research and practice guides on a variety of things like campus hate, racism, discrimination, bias, point to several consistent elements. One is that leaders say out loud repeatedly that interrupting, exclusion, and discrimination is actually a part of everyone's role. So, it's a part of the job description, not just a part of the PR statement. And then policies and codes of conduct, specific examples are named of harmful behavior and what appropriate in the moment responses can look like. And so this is when the principles turn into action, because unless you have specific examples, it's hard to say based on an interpretive lens that this was discriminatory or it wasn't. Silence is never neutral. And if harm is happening and we do nothing, it's clear that we've already made a decision. Also, you got to make reporting easy, safe, and worth it, because people won't confront harm if they believe nothing's going to happen or that they'll pay the price for speaking up. And so you got to provide visible, simple, and when needed, anonymous reporting mechanisms with clear explanations of what happens next and a timely response. Prohibit retaliation in policy and enforce that prohibition in practice so that interveners and reporters aren't quietly punished for making things difficult. And then communicate outcomes back to the community as much as confidentiality allows, so that people see that the reports actually make a difference and not just documentation. Because if always speaking up feels like sticking your neck out, we shouldn't be surprised when people keep their heads buried in the sand or keep their heads down. And of course, you got to train people in how, not just why. Bystander intervention and anti-discrimination are both efforts that are helpful. Sadly, the people that need it most are the ones that are usually most reticent and reluctant to participate. The people that understand its value are the ones that usually will show up. And so you got to find ways to either make it mandatory in policy and volition, or find other creative ways to teach people about the diverse world that they live in. Practical trainings are helpful. Short, if you see this, try saying that, or if you experience this, try that, is helpful. And then normalizing a range of interventions, direct and indirect, are important, because people don't rise to our values, they actually fall to the level of their training. Finally, if you don't get a speak up culture from a memo, you get it when courage is built into how the place works, pays, and promotes. So, I think validating and rewarding courage is really important, especially because one of the things that we see is how comfort loves performative charity, but then courage loves substantive change, like I said earlier. And we got to find a better way to do this, because our world is burning.
Thank you, Ray. Vanessa, would you like to add some thoughts?
Yeah, I think, Ray, that was a lot to think about, because I think one of the things that most people don't really have a historical perspective of their institutions and the foundation, and also just the basis of what that the just the understanding of the history of the institution, to the point where what is that has that institution stood for a long period of time. We go to work for places and don't even have a background, or we take on these jobs. So when you come to work for, especially an administrative position, you're taking on a perspective of that institution. And if you don't buy into it or don't believe it, or if you don't know it, then you can't use it. So I think it's so important that when you understand the historical perspective of the institution, you can use sometimes their language or their history to stand up for certain things when you feel like you don't really have a voice in that area. So I just think it's also just another avenue of how do we begin to understand the places where we work. I say this all the time with my students when I was teaching family therapy or marriage and family counseling and all the courses like that, is we take on people's last names and we have no idea what that last name could be. A group of serial killers, but we take on people's last names and we don't know the history of the last name. We don't know where that name came from. We just take on things and not knowing. And I think this is so critical in this time when you're really kind of shaping up effective allyship, or just understanding yourself, understand where you work and the history of where you work. And sometimes you can use that history to leverage in conversations that this is what we've always stood for. This institution stood for, or this institution never stood for this. And so just knowing that and having that historical perspective of where you work, I think can go a long way.
Thank you, Vanessa. Mary, I know you have some thoughts on this as well. I'd love to hear them.
Sure. I think I actually have, I want to tell a brief story about a situation that happened in my former workplace. And the reason I want to share it in line with sort of this question and this idea of the dismantling of DEI efforts is, I hope I'm thinking more than anything else of the people on this call who've taken the time out of their day to listen in and try to wrap our heads around what allyship means, or how each of us should act in a time like this. So I share the story that I was working at an independent K-12 school in which the DEI efforts were really not being dismantled over the past few years. And I say that because it's a unique dilemma in a context where the DEI efforts are actually very supported by liberals or by wealthy people who have an interest in DEI for a variety of reasons. And I share that because sometimes the complexity of this work goes beyond just like binaries of the institution is either dismantling or it's not. And what happened in my particular case is I had a particular role in DEI. I was the DEI director there. And when in 2023, the concern in Gaza, Palestinian people came up, at that time, I had already been reading about and attempting to take meaningful, sustained action for about 10 years before then. And so when that came across sort of a renewed public attention at that time, or had become more in my realm of consciousness, I knew that I had to understand this situation better. And so I read. And when I read, I began to see the connections between forms of power and oppression that occur across groups and across time. And as soon as you can see those connections, it's not difficult to identify that if the school is telling you that you cannot advocate for Palestinian people, you cannot raise these questions in the classroom, you cannot develop inquiry-based learning for children around what's going on in Gaza, developing, like Vanessa has been saying this whole time, an internal sense of who you are and what you stand for and the justice principles you stand for. I knew that I was in a position where what they were telling me that I could not talk about and could not lead within the context of very backed DEI efforts was simply wrong. It would have been wrong for me to continue to advocate for marginalized groups across a variety of identities and omit the Palestinian or Arab people from our advocacy efforts. And I want to link that to something that I hope will be helpful for other people like me who've been in this for a while trying to find my way. Why Dr. Caldwell's framing of what allyship is in terms of allyship for justice is so important is because I didn't have the benefit of having at that time Palestinian people telling me what I should or should not do. And I've had my Black friends telling me it's not safe to say anything, just lay low, because if you lose your job, you won't be able to have the impact you had. I had teachers saying, let's just keep quiet. I had Arab friends give me a keffiyeh and say, thank you for wearing this, but do not mention anything. We had to go off campus for them to share their concerns. That's a heightened sense of power and oppression and what can go wrong if you speak up in this context. So I share that to say that in connection to if I had relied on just what the marginalized people around me were in sort of advising me to do, I would not have made what I would consider to be what I must do. And what I must do is stand up for justice in all circumstances. Ultimately, I was dismissed from the role because I said, I cannot stand for this. I cannot do that. And in doing so, I have been outside of the formal institution for some time now. And so people who are allies who may find themselves in positions of being outside a formal institution might say, where do I step in as an ally? I'm underemployed. I don't even have a job. Where do I fit? And there's a place for allyship everywhere in any group that you're in, or talking to your public officials, whatever the case may be. And then I just want to sort of wrap this up with the idea that Palestinian people don't owe me anything. Nobody, no marginalized group owes me their appreciation, their affinity, their friendship, their love and affection, their affirmation. Nobody. So if I don't hear one positive word for the rest of my life, and I have had an incredible amount of affirmation and support from the Palestinian community. But if I don't, people have asked me, if you knew what was going to happen if you made that decision, would you make it again? I said, I can't not, because it's a principle that I stand on. And I will do it again if I have the courage, and again and again and again, regardless. And that only comes, I believe, from an internal conviction. But you don't always have the encouragement that you want. But I think it's really dangerous for allies like me, who starting out my journey about 10 years ago, is I suffered from sort of this longing to belong to the communities I was advocating for. Like I longed to be affirmed, to show that I'm not like the other racist people. I don't want to be like them. And so sort of relying on marginalized communities to be your source of affirmation, I think is a little bit on the wrong path. But it's normal, because everybody wants to be affirmed. Everyone wants to be told that what they're doing is helpful. But I think as we continue, hopefully everyone on the call continue to develop that stamina, that courage to continue, it's less likely that we'll waver. So if you could just consider, what do I stand for? What can I not agree to? And what am I willing to lose? And we've established that ahead of time. When the moment comes, you'll know, because it's cultivated from within. You're saying, I can't stand for that. So that's kind of weaving through this idea of like within institutions, outside of institutions. The role of allyship connected to justice is saying there's room for everybody to keep learning and growing, especially when, like Vanessa keeps saying, we develop and cultivate our own sense of conviction and sense of identity and self. And I can say, I've made the decision that I stand on. And that's what I'll continue to stand by.
That's fantastic, and a really great example. I think it truly exemplifies what everybody's been talking about here today, which is this is a principle. It's a way of living. It's a way of thinking. Vanessa the other day called it gut work. It's a part of who you are as a human being. It's not an idea or a concept or an office or a program. Not that I'm putting down offices and programs. I think they're incredibly important, just like Wilmore said earlier. But it comes from internally. So I don't want to miss out the opportunity to ask this last question, because I think it's what everybody's waiting to hear. So I'm going to start with you, Sheila, if that's okay. And what do you think is most needed from Allies for Justice right now? What actions can people take to demonstrate courage and consistency and conviction moving forward? I think Mary just shared a real life example, truly. Would love to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I can't let the moment be lost on what Mary said, because I know her. I almost want you to go to somebody else, because I know her. I knew the price she paid for that.
All right, I'll tell you what, how about if I go to Dr. Brown for a minute and then maybe come back to you if you want, or we'll open it up for questions. So Dr. Brown, I'd love your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, Mary, I thank you for sharing that, because I think it when you just brought me back to so many times I've had to stand up, and it comes with a cost. Courage comes with a cost. And I know that it's important that you understand and know who you are. I'm reminded of James Baldwin, and I'll read his quote. James Baldwin in 1963 in his book, The Fire Next Time, when he states that love takes off the mask that we wear. We cannot live without, and no, we cannot live within. And he's not talking about love in the romantic sense. He's talking about love really as a sense of self, and how we it's rooted in love for justice and doing the right thing no matter what. And so when I think of that's what leads to courage. So I go back to this whole conversation really rests with doing some soul searching within yourself. If you're going to lead in this space, in a justice space, where we're talking about equality and equity and of justice, we're going to lead in this space. You've got to personally do some soul searching and self-evaluation, and be honest with yourself about whether you are really able to be an ally in that space, so that you don't do harm and don't do performative things. And that's okay. But recognizing I've got some individual work to do so that I can lead in this space. And so I think as I said, one of the main things is really looking within requires courage. And it's painful sometimes to look at yourself, because you say, well, I've been doing this so many years, but how much harm has I done? I mean, how much do I really know? And what am I willing to be grounded in and stand firm on? And that true commitment to change is an ongoing process and ongoing growth. And you've got to be committed to that in order to do this work and be effective allyship. So take it soul searching.
Thank you. I'd love to go back to Dr. Caldwell.
Yes, thank you for that moment to get myself together. And thank you, Mary, for not just sharing the story, but as you were talking, I was like, is she going to share the outcome? Because you paid a price for that. But I think if I could use a term that some of us will appreciate, you counted the cost ahead of time, right? You knew what it would take. Like, I'm going to already know what my conviction is ahead of time. So when the time comes, because if you are a true justice for ally, the time is going to come where your conviction will be tested. And that might be one of the ways to know if you are a true justice for ally, is your conviction going to actually be tested? And I think it's also important to note that based on what you said, that you wasn't the president, you wasn't the CEO, even though you had a leadership title, you wasn't like, even in this high position. And I think oftentimes it wasn't necessarily this grand gesture. Like you said, it was a symbol of support. And that symbol of support, basically, you lost your livelihood. You were terminated from that position because they did not want you to proudly display your advocacy for justice and your symbol of support. And I think that's a lesson for all of us today. I think we have a lot of higher education professionals on here. And I think that even though people might not have a formal authority, we all have power, we have dominion, and we have agency over the spaces that we occupy. So if you're in financial aid, justice could look like figuring out how to help a student get a scholarship and how to make sure that they know how to fill out the FAFSA form properly and look at affordability barriers. If you're in admissions and it's been a lot of advocacy against people having access. The whole termination of affirmative action was against that. But we also know that there are things that we can do, and we know that there are groups who have been excluded from higher education for centuries now. And then we can make a decision without violating the law that we're going to still expand access. That's something that admissions officers can do. We have faculty who can make sure that they have equitable learning environments. That is not against the law. And I think it's important to say that because it's also this notion that are we violating whatever we should be violating by doing justice work? And I want you to ask how ridiculous that question sounds and how in some ways it's even pathetic that we would even have to think about doing the right thing. And if we're somehow violating a law in a country that talks about a justice, right? And stands as one of the principles of justice. If I had to think about symbolically what justice looked like, we, on our Supreme Court and how we represent it, we talk about the scales of justice. And so one of the things that we have to ask ourselves is there balance? Are there groups? There's nothing that stops us when we talk about what do we need to do now. There is nothing that stops us from looking at internal data and say who is striving and who is suffering in this environment. And we can make decisions in real time based on our positions and our roles and our agency to seek balance, to make sure that there are not groups who are 90% graduation rates, and we have other groups that are 40%, and then we want to apply a deficit mindset approach, and we don't want to think about justice. And one of the things I want to say about justice is that justice demands memory. You cannot talk about justice if you're not willing to look at the past and see who has been harmed. Justice is not compatible with forgetting. So we want to say, oh, let's just focus on now, let's forget about the past, and you actually don't want to do justice work. It is not the definition of justice. So we cannot ignore what has happened to these students who are coming to our campus, what has happened to the faculty and staff members who have been a part of marginalized communities and still do justice work. So I just want to say that regardless of what the organization is doing, it is up to us to make those personal commitments, to have that personal conviction, and to sustain and to endure regardless because of our personal resolve.
I agree. And one of the things, that I think we've also seen over the last couple of years is a lot of amnesia from organizations and leaders and institutions who not only forget when they were an ally or pretended to be an ally, but then wanted to deny that they ever spoke in that space, supported it, lived in it when they tried to do something else in their career. Oh, no, that wasn't me. I've changed my mind. I don't think like that anymore. So it's not just remembering your principles, but continuing to be able to look yourself in the mirror as who you are as a person. So that's just my 2 cents. Christina, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And then I'm trying to see if there's questions in here we want to make sure we address. I know we only have a few minutes left.
Thank you so much. Yes, Holly, thank you so much. And Dr. Jeboa, thank you. Thank you. You to touch my heart, and I absolutely. I think that when the programs or when institutions do not align with your values, you already know you're still gonna have to do things regardless of the consequences, and it is a courage in order to do that. If we don't have courage, we're going to continue being silent and being complicit of the injustices that happen. And in my case, I much rather move away from something that I am just basically perpetuating something that it is not worth my time and my principles to just check a box, right, for an institution or for anybody. And so I think that right now that we are in this world that many people feel afraid, isolated, unheard, uncertain about everything that is happening, including students, faculty, staff, societies, communities, right? When we heard then we feel they do not belong. I feel included in all of this, right? And in those moments, allyship cannot be just something that we practice only when it is convenient. I think that when issues directly affect us, it is the time that it's to see the whole scope of the things. If it is affecting me, it is affecting somebody else, because we are like literally all of us doing the world in this together. And it is such a cliche phrase, but really is. There's plenty for everybody, and we should not be just limiting the resources for other people's. And so for me, allyship has to become a commitment to human dignity. What is most needed from allies right now, it is the courage to remain human, to use appropriate language. Words matter, and we often use demeaning language to strip people of their humanity. So courage to encourage unity instead of division, courage to listen and to speak up the injustices we see, to not grow silent, otherwise we become complicit of injustices. We need consistency to show up before crisis, during crisis, and after the crisis fades. It means building trusting and lasting relationship, not just showing up to make a statement. I think that we need conviction to act according to our values, and even if it is uncomfortable. For me, allyship is less about speaking for people and more about helping create conditions where everyone can be heard, respected, and treated fairly. And I think, as you mentioned, Holly, about the amnesia, I think that there's this sort of awareness, and it is a loud secret of the things that are happening, and we just stay complacent, and we're not moving into action. And I think that that's what we need right now, to move into action, through relationships, through accountability, with humility, curiosity, and the commitment to the dignity and the belonging of all people. And I think that I am not somebody in my role to make the decisions who is worthy of opportunity, of dignity. My role is as an educator to help people thrive, regardless of who they are, regardless of their socioeconomic, regardless of who they are. And I think that in higher education, we need to be humble. We need a lot of humility. We are in an institutions of education, and we are sometimes being the gatekeepers of the progress and the thriving of other populations. And how dare we call educators in higher education if we're doing that, and in society in general. So for me, that is speaking for myself, right? That is to be courageous, conviction, and actionable, and helping people, really helping ourselves to create the conditions for people to thrive, regardless of who they are.
That's perfect transition. We're going to have time for one, maybe two questions, but here's the first question. How can professors who personally feel less vulnerable to the consequences of anti-diversity become greater assets, better allies on matters of diversity? How can they support otherwise committed colleagues whose tenure and promotion status might make them less confident about agitating for this cause? Who would love to? I mean, I'll be happy to call on somebody, but if one of you has a burning answer. Okay, I'm going to go with Sheila.
Yes. So one of our external partners is the American Colleges and University Educators, and they specifically, we've had about 323 professors participate in this program, and they actually have modules and courses over a year's time about fostering belonging in the classroom, effective teaching practices, pedagogy. And one of the things that's interesting about that is that when we first started the program, we did a pre-assessment. 30% of faculty said that they had confidence to talk about inclusive pedagogy in the classroom. And then after they took the module and some of the courses, it went up to like 85%. And so I mentioned that to say from that cohort of professors, I've had a group of professors come to me and say, we would like to actually, under a new umbrella title, create a program called Professors of Equity. Now, these are seasoned professors who have tenure, and they are actually saying that we're going to be the ones to test some of these inclusive practices in our classrooms. We already know what works, some of the things that don't work. And so they're going to be the example for our junior faculty. We had graduate students who were going into the teaching profession in those programs. And we also had professors who have been around for 20 or 25 years. So I think when you have seasoned professors who are doing anti-diversity work, who are not shying away from data on disparities and the language that is necessary to promote greater student success, then I think junior faculty are going to, just by your example, have some of that permission to be able to do that. But I have found, I specifically mentioned that external partner because I feel like it's really helped advance us. And even along with that, we have measurable improvements where we've improved DFW rates by 6%. And we also have closed the institutional equity gap between our Black and white students as well on one of our campuses. And I'm speaking from a system office perspective. So again, and we would not be able to have those results without our senior faculty inspiring our younger faculty to follow suit.
Thank you, Sheila. I think I'm going to direct the last question at Vanessa because we only have 2 minutes, but I think it really ties to some of the things that you said before about knowing your organization. How do we determine if our institutions or a potential future institution or employer will have these values and actually enact them? What advice do you have to determine when you're trying to make a change within your current context versus looking to move on to a place that seems more aligned to justice work?
I think that it's just so important that before you sign on to an institution, you do some background, not just in the job description, but really, as I said before, some historical background of the institution, the values of the institution, and how have they operationalize those values before you even join the institution, rather than just taking a job, but really knowing that you're buying into an institution that has a certain presence and known for justice work or known for equitable practices. I mean, just understanding that. And then I think overall is just, again, self-evaluation, knowing who you are. And can you actually live within that institution, knowing who you really are? You know, I often tell the story that sometimes that in my institution, there were many times that I weren't invited to certain meetings. Well, I'm a change agent. I'm clear about who I am. I understand the history of my institution. I understand the history of people. I understand humanity. I understand human behavior. So anytime wasn't invited to certain rooms, or I don't feel bad about it because I know I'm a change agent and they may say something, that is going to require me. I'm not going to keep quiet about it. I'll say something about it. Now I've disrupted the plan because generally, and after having worked in Superior Court for many years and doing child welfare work before coming in higher education, I often know deals were cut in the back room before we even got to the courtroom. So many times I know that when there's meetings, there's things have already been decided. So when you get in the meeting, that's performative. It's just that they just know who's going to speak one way and who's not going to speak. So when I wasn't invited to certain spaces, I'm good with it because I know I'm going to disrupt. And they know I'm going to disrupt maybe something that was said, or I'm not going to feel good about it. So I think it's really understanding who you are and who you are in the institution. And can you live with the fact that that institution is not have actionable things that shows a history of equitable practice or a commitment to change.
Thank you, Vanessa. I just want to say thank you to all of our panelists. This was an amazing conversation. I never had any doubt. I knew it was going to be really rich, really thought-provoking, and no pun intended, really insightful. I want to thank everybody who also attended today for your wonderful questions and conversation in the chat, and encourage everybody to have a really fantastic rest of their day. And thank you again to this amazing group of panelists. I'm getting a little choked up, so I'm just going to say thank you. This was fantastic, and I hope you all stay safe and happy and healthy.
Yes, and thanks to Insight into Academia, to Holly and Lenore for allowing us to have this space, this conversation. And we hope that this is just the beginning of future conversations about this work, and that we'll have an opportunity to help future leaders that's on this journey of justice, and we're able to provide more for them. So thank you.
It's our privilege,
Holly and Lenore.
Thank you. To be able to do this. So thank you for honoring us with this conversation. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.